All right, welcome back to the FITSNews studios, another edition of your Week in Review. We are going back to business school this week, folks. A ton of corporate stories that we're following. Of course, we're going to focus on the Boeing saga, the dead whistleblower who was exposing all manner of issues at one of America's largest and most storied corporations. We're going to bring you the very latest on that story. Also, we're going to tell you about a story involving Blackbaud, one of South Carolina's largest companies, based down in Charleston, employing over 1,000 South Carolinians. What's happening to that company? We're going to walk you through all the details. Last but not least, we're going to focus on your health, one of the silent cancers, one that doesn't get talked a lot about. We're going to tell you what it is, why it matters, and what you can do to protect yourself and your loved ones. All that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. So obviously we cover a lot of true crime news at FITSNews, crime in courts, we cover politics, we cover sports, but we also cover business, particularly when business stories impact businesses here in South Carolina, jobs here in South Carolina. Obviously keeping a close eye on crony capitalist deals that involve your money being taken and given to select companies. We keep a very close eye on those deals, but we also follow private companies that find themselves embroiled in scandals. And that happened in a big way over the last few weeks involving Blackbaud. Now, a lot of you who live in South Carolina are very familiar with this company. If you work at a nonprofit and finance in any way, you're obviously very familiar with this company. It is a leading cloud software firm that handles lots of data, lots of information for nonprofits, for all sorts of different clients, educational clients, some corporate clients, but a very big company. It's worth several billion dollars. It's headquartered in Charleston, originally founded in New York back in the early 1980s, but moved to Charleston, employs about 3,000 people globally, at least 1,000 of those here in the Palmetto State. So what's going on with Blackbaud? Well, last month, the company's CEO, Michael Giannone, was arrested by police on the Isle of Palms in connection with a driving under the influence allegation. Apparently he was weaving over the fog line. Apparently his speech was slurred. Apparently there was a strong odor of alcohol emanating from the vehicle, and Giannone failed field sobriety tests, according to officers with the Isle of Palms Police Department. He also, quote, got argumentative with them, repeatedly asking them, why are we doing this? So a lot of times when we cover arrests like this, they will spark tips on other crimes or other allegations involving folks. But in Giannone's case, it uncovered a great deal of, well, corporate fodder, particularly 4 days after this DUI arrest. He unloaded approximately 25,000 shares of Blackbaud stock, which is currently trading in the $70 to $72 range. And this is part of a 50,000 share dump over the course of the past year. Also interesting, in the weeks following the arrest, Blackbaud ditched what's called a poison pill or a shareholder rights agreement, basically freeing the company up for a potential takeover. All of these things are happening at a very pivotal time for Blackbaud, which several years ago was involved in a massive data breach. This involved more than 13,000 clients, over 1 million files. Blackbaud actually paid a $250,000 ransom to the hacker that stole this information, paid it in Bitcoin apparently. But it has exposed Blackbaud to any number of lawsuits. In fact, just this past week, there was a hearing in Charleston, South Carolina, where a federal judge, Joseph Anderson, is considering whether to consolidate these cases into one class action. Now, the company has already set aside money, apparently $50 million, we're told, to deal with this class action lawsuit if it materializes. But this has got employees at Blackbaud, shareholders, extremely nervous, and the arrest of Giannone brought a lot of this to light. Now, what happened with this hack? A couple things. First of all, Blackbaud failed miserably to secure its data. We're talking about Social Security information that was totally unencrypted and security that was obviously leaving gaping holes for hackers to exploit. But it was worse than that. When the hack went down, the company issued a statement telling all of its clients nothing to worry about. No sensitive information was obtained. Everything's fine. Go about your business. Well, several months later, it turned out that statement was completely false. And so in addition to having to settle with 49 states' attorneys general, including Attorney General Alan Wilson here in South Carolina. Over the breach itself, Blackbaud also had to pay a $3 million fine for lying about the hack, lying about the data that was actually exposed. Also, all of this is occurring at a time when the company failed to hit its earnings for the fourth quarter of 2023. And oh, by the way, that news broke right before the Giannone DUI arrest, causing a 14% drop in Blackbaud's stock price. Again, why do we care about all this? Well, we care because 1,000 people in Charleston, South Carolina, who are integral parts of that economy are depending on this company. A lot of nonprofits, a lot of hospitals, a lot of universities are depending on this company. And when it lets them down, again, letting all of us down. At FITSNews, though, we will continue to keep tabs on Blackbaud in a way that the mainstream media hasn't, bringing you not only the very latest as Giannone's criminal case moves forward, but more importantly, on the status of this company, which is clearly in the midst of a major transition that could affect, again, more than 1,000 jobs here in South Carolina. So the big story in Charleston, South Carolina this week continues to be the alleged suicide, of Boeing whistleblower John Barnett. Now, this is a story our media outlet has covered from multiple different angles. We've covered it as a crime story, but we've also covered it within the broader context of what's going on at Boeing, one of America's largest corporate crony companies, a company that got $1 billion to locate here in South Carolina, part of a battle between Boeing and the unions there in the state of Washington. But John Barnett was a 35-year employee of Boeing, spent more than 2 decades at the Washington State facility, but then he spent his last decade with Boeing in North Charleston at the 787 Dreamliner facility. And after retiring in 2017, he became one of the more famous whistleblowers in America, exposing all manner of product process deficiencies, workmanship issues, all manner of problems in the production of the 787 jet. But one of the areas that we haven't covered yet, and one of the stories that ran this week on FITSNews.com by our research director, Jen Wood, dealt with the context of the deposition that Mr. Barnett missed when they found his body. This was the whistleblower lawsuit that, again, he was in the middle of a deposition at the time of his death. And I'm joined by Jen Wood. Jen, you covered this story in depth. This is one of the articles I am most proud of on FITSNews.com because it was literally every facet of this story. And I wanted to start this conversation with you. I wanted to ask you about 2 events related to Boeing's history that led us to where we are. The first event was in the 90s. It was the merger with McDonnell Douglas. And the second event was right before the company decided to launch the 737 MAX, because those two, and that was in 2010, I believe.
Yeah.
But those 2 points of reference, those 2 key events play very prominently in the narrative of John Barnett, don't they?
They do, absolutely. And, the merger, me, the business stuff, it's not my favorite. But, immediately when John Barnett's death was announced, I started getting texts like, you have to look at this. This is a conspiracy. There's no way he committed suicide. So I kind of started brushing up on my aerospace, which made my husband very happy because he is actually an aerospace engineer. And that merger with McDonnell Douglas happened in 1997 and kind of set Boeing on the track that it's currently on now, which is not good. McDonnell Douglas, when they merged, everybody said McDonnell Douglas. Boeing acquired McDonnell Douglas, but McDonnell Douglas culture is what transferred over to Boeing. So it really felt more like McDonnell Douglas had acquired Boeing. So while Boeing has a long and storied history in aerospace, its reputation was safety and quality. And when McDonnell Douglas came in, they kind of pulled back, and it became, the decisions being made for the company became more financial. So it was being more driven by financial decisions and not by engineering.
And a lot of the independence of particularly on the civil aeronautics side, a lot of the independence that those folks initially had took a back seat under the McDonnell Douglas leadership, because you pointed out a lot of folks had said it was a reverse acquisition, because the leadership of McDonnell Douglas ended up running the new company, even though it was Boeing that ostensibly bought McDonnell Douglas. And Jen, one of the things I thought was fascinating about your research, you had dug up where this was something that was spurred on by the Clinton administration was trying to get lower defense costs. They were looking for less bidding. They were trying to consolidate this so that they would not have to pay as much in the post-Cold War era for weapon systems. Boeing, obviously, and McDonnell Douglas, big defense contractors. But walk us through, Jen, as this new company began to compete in the aerospace, or not aerospace, rather the commercial aircraft industry. Obviously, a competitor, Airbus, emerging from France. Walk us through how that competition impacted this 737 MAX saga.
So Boeing's landmark plane is the 737, and that was launched in the early 80s. And it's a passenger airline. It has performed well for Boeing. It is what they've relied on in terms of their civil aircraft for decades. And while Boeing is, one of the huge competitors in the aerospace industry, they're competing against primarily Airbus. And Airbus saw that, saw a need to lower cost for airlines and started designing engines that use less fuel. I didn't know this, but one of commercial airliners' biggest cost in their budget is fuel expenses. So, Airbus started moving towards launching a plane that would be more fuel efficient, and Boeing kind of sat back and they weren't working on anything.
Caught napping, weren't they?
Yeah. So when Airbus announced the launch of this more fuel efficient plane, Boeing they had to scramble and they had to make decisions. And they decided, instead of designing an entirely new aircraft, they would take that 737 and put more fuel efficient engines on it.
And tell us how this process worked.
So in that process, the 737, when it was launched, it was before luggage handling was automated. So It was when they had luggage handlers placing the luggage on the plane. They didn't have those conveyor belts that you see loading your luggage onto the plane before you board. And so they had the wings and the aircraft are lower to the ground. So they made these fuel efficient engines. And then when they went to mount them on the plane, because the wings were so low and they mount them under the wings, they had to move these large engines more forward and up on the wings.
Yeah, because you could look at these planes, and the 737 MAX much lower to the ground than the Airbus, was the Neo, I think the big fuel efficient Airbus plane. Is Boeing jet much lower.
Right. So they've got these engines, they put them further up on these wings. And what that did is it created a risk of the aircraft, the nose of it during takeoff, going up based on the weight. So what they did to do this, to correct this, is they put a sensor on it that feeds into an electronic system.
By the way, one sensor too.
One sensor, not two. Well, yeah. So we'll talk about that. So that sensor, if the nose goes up too far, it would alert this electronic system, and the aircraft would automatically lower the nose. So it would adjust the flap on the back where it would lower the nose. But here's the thing: is they didn't tell any of the pilots that were trained on the 737 who would be flying the new 737 MAX of this system. Because if they changed the original aircraft design too much, they would have to spend the money to retrain all of these pilots on the new aircraft.
To get the FAA certification.
Right, to get the FAA certification. So to keep costs lower with FAA, they just, we're just going to slide this in. So there were two very large airliner crashes caused by the system. And what had happened is, the plane took off, the sensor failed, and the nose is going up, the plane's trying to correct it down, and they ultimately crashed, killing, you have the number in your head because you remember this stuff,
but killing 346 people in two crashes. And in fact, we were just looking at one of the simulator there from that second crash, the Ethiopian air crash, just you can see it just as you were describing it. It's almost like fighting against that automated system that was pulling it back down.
Right. So, I
So,
mean, it was simply it was a cost saving measure for Boeing. Instead of training these pilots, instead of notifying them that the system had been put on, they didn't train them. And there was just one sensor, and the sensor's on the nose of the plane. That means there's one point of failure. So if that sensor fails, there's no backup. And when you've got something that critical to keeping an airplane in the air, a commercial airplane with passengers, and you don't have a second point of failure, you've got a recipe for disaster.
and one of the things I remembered in your story that just really hit me was that line about how Boeing farmed out some of the coding for this $9 an hour coding out of Pakistan on this system that, again, responsible for ensuring the safety of the thousands of people that fly this jet every day. Jen, let me ask you this, because this morphs into the discussion of John Barnett.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the 737 MAX, in the aftermath of these two crashes, it was grounded for an extended period of time. Boeing had to pay, I believe, $2.5 billion, including a huge chunk to the airlines, $500 million to the families of the victims of those crashes, and I think a cool $250 million to the government in fines. But in the aftermath of that, and part of an agreement not to be prosecuted criminally, commitments were made regarding the manufacturing processes moving forward. And one of the things John Barnett was pointing out was that, hey, they're still not safe. They're still not doing the job that they're supposed to do to ensure safety. And he was proven right again, Jen, in January of this year, wasn't he?
Yes. So John Barnett's role at Boeing, he was a quality control manager. So he basically he oversaw individuals who were putting the parts on the plane. And he said when he began, there was one quality control manager for every 15 employees. And by the time that he ultimately retired, there was one for every 50. And he said it's just not feasible for one quality control manager to oversee that many employees and ensure that these planes are being built to the standards that they need to be.
Well, not only that, Jen, now we're looking at this report from the National Transportation Safety Board regarding Boeing apparently covering up this latest incident involving an Alaska Air jet where one of the panels blew out in midair at 16,000 feet. Luckily, no one died as a result of that accident, but the plane had to land back in Portland, Oregon. And this was the incident that John Barnett was beginning to speak again about, that culture at Boeing, the culture of speed that put, again, profits and deliveries above safety of the air traveling public. And Jim, we're looking at a situation now where Boeing has apparently told the NTSB, we have no record of the work that was done on this plane that the panel blew out. And we can't make the crew supervisor available because they have a health problem. So there's no records, nothing to see here. Move along.
Just carry on. I mean,
And John Barnett was exposing that culture.
Right. And, the weekend that he died, two big things happened right around the same time and immediately after. Is first, it was announced that there is a criminal investigation into Boeing by the Department of Justice. I believe the Washington Post may have announced that. And then the other one was that Boeing had spectacularly failed a safety audit that was done by the FAA in its manufacturing facilities. So all of those happened right around the same time that John Barnett was found in his truck in Charleston.
Actually, the Wall Street Journal was the one that broke that first one, and the New York Times had the second one. But two great reports. But and you cited those actually in the report you filed. Jen, let me ask you this. Based on what we know about this case, you've read the statements from John Barnett's attorneys. You watched the interview with his friends and family. Is there any chance here that this is what we are being told it is, that it's a suicide? I mean, obviously we've got a police report, single gunshot wound to the temple, guns in his hand, fingers on the trigger. There's a note. We don't know what's on the note. you cover cases like that. What does your gut tell you on this one, Jen?
My gut is screaming conspiracy. I'm trying to, not everything is what do you always say? Everything is a conspiracy, but nothing's a conspiracy. But with this one, just the timing of it, right in the middle of his deposition, right in the middle of all this devastating news for Boeing, it just doesn't sit right with me. But I also looked at a lot of research into how being a corporate whistleblower affects the mental health of an individual. And his family said he did have PTSD and suffered from depression and anxiety as a result of his career at Boeing and his role as a whistleblower. So you can go either way, but it's still my gut instinct is there's more to this story than a simple death by suicide. Certainly, it's very sad for his family either way. I don't know if we're ever going to have answers. I still have open FOIAs out for, 911 calls, final autopsy reports, all of the stuff that I'd like to look at. I'd like to know if there was, security cameras in the parking lot of that hotel. Were the security cameras working? There's a lot of questions that are still unanswered that would help me make a more educated decision. But right now, I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that about screaming out for a conspiracy here. I mean, everything was aligned, again, for him to play a pivotal role in what was a critical moment in the evolution of this company, calling them out for processes and problems that, again, should have been dealt with, that the company said were dealt with, but now finding out with these latest accidents that they may not have been. And not just the 737 MAX, John Barnett also sounding the alarm on problems with the 787 Dreamliner, which is manufactured there in the North Charleston facility, exposing some of the similar problems there. Jen, obviously amazing work on that story that really pulled a ton of different complicated angles together into one just incredibly concise piece that really dove into all these angles. Great work, Jen, and please keep us in the loop on everything that you find regarding that investigation, the FOIAs you put out. Jen, don't you agree on a case that this is this big, that's this high profile, they're going to have to come clean with all of this material? They can't.
Yeah,
They're going to have to release the note. They're going to have to release the surveillance footage. Do you agree?
Yeah, they're going to have to be very transparent with this investigation, or else, the questions aren't going to get answered. People are still going to think
is there a
conspiracy.
And I hate to speculate too morbidly here, but is there a possibility that his death has been captured on camera?
Every hotel that I have stayed in the past 10 years, there have been security cameras in the parking lot. That's, just lots of cars, parking lot. They get broken into a lot. So I would be surprised if they say that there's no security camera or that the camera wasn't working. I would have a lot of questions about that. I would actually be surprised if it hadn't been captured.
Keep that footage away from Boeing. They'll disappear it real quick, won't they?
Yeah.
Well, Jen, I just want to thank you again, not only for the work you did, but also I love that you reported on some of those statements from the family about his mental state as a whistleblower, and you're leaving that door open in your mind and keeping an open mind about this case, that it could actually be a suicide as it's been reported. So I really appreciate that too, Jen, just letting the story guide your reporting, not any kind of preconceived notions. But I'm with you. This is a company that for years, for decades, has been too big to fail, too big to prosecute. And this was a guy who was standing up in the gap and saying, enough. I'm going to call this company out and expose these problems. And until I see differently, I'm going to assume he paid for that with his life, Jen.
I agree.
Jen Wood, everybody, thank you so much, and keep it tuned to FITSNews for the very latest on the Boeing whistleblower saga. So we've all seen the different colored ribbons for different types of cancer, seeking to raise interest, awareness, and of course money to fight these deadly diseases. But there's one cancer that impacts hundreds of thousands of Americans each year that doesn't get quite the attention as some of the others. Why is that, and what can you do to protect yourself? For that, I sat down with Dr. Thomas Mazza, a surgeon at Lexington Medical Center. Here's that conversation. We've all heard the joke, I'm looking forward to that like a colonoscopy. But it's not that bad, is it? So walk us through the process. How does it?
The worst part of colonoscopy is doing a prep the day beforehand. That flushes everything out of your system. And in order to get a good look inside the colon with colonoscopy, you have to wash the stool away. So you do an oral preparation that flushes everything out of your system. That's the worst part. After that, then you come in. I mean, you have to get stuck with a needle for an IV, and you're put off to sleep in a nice, comfortable state. You have a good sleep while this procedure is done. You wake up, you're able to go home and eat what you want to.
Nice.
That's the procedure itself is not as bad as people are thinking that it's going to be. Of course, people don't want to be awake for it, and which is understandable. If you were awake for it, that would be bad.
Now, the age range, typically 45 is what we're hearing. But
age 45 is what we're doing for average risk screening, meaning that people don't have a family history of colorectal cancer. They're not having symptoms. They don't have a history of polyps themselves.
Well, walk us through the risk factors. You mentioned just a minute ago genetics. That's a huge part of it, right?
Yes. So 30% of colorectal cancers have some sort of genetic predisposition. Only about 5% of them do we actually know the genetic defect that we can test for. And that's based on significant family history, at least 3 family members over 2 generations, typically one younger than the age of 50, is a hereditary non-polyposis colorectal cancer, and familial adenomatous polyposis, where the colon is literally carpeted with polyps, which is a dominant genetic trait for the patients that oftentimes they're needing surgical intervention early on, and they have a very high potential for cancer development with that condition.
But there are other factors.
There are other, certainly, all the factors that lead towards colorectal cancer are your genetics, what you were born with, and then the environmental factors that you live with, the foods that you eat, mostly the foods that you eat, but smoking, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, those types of environmental factors are also a contributor to colorectal cancer, your susceptibility to colorectal cancer.
That's a wrap for this week's edition of Your Week in Review. A quick programming note. Next week, we won't be doing the show. Why? Because we're trying something new. The Month in Review. First time ever. Live right here. We're going to be taking your questions, discussing topics that you submit. It's going to be at 11 a.m. this coming Friday, March 29. The best part, to participate, you don't have to do anything except sign up for our newsletter on FITSNews.com. If you haven't already, go over to FITSNews.com, sign up for that newsletter. We'll be sending out a Google Sheet that not only invites you to submit the topics you want to hear us discuss, but your questions on those topics. I know we're going to be talking about the Boeing Turner saga, the teen rapist who has once again brought South Carolina's broken judicial system back under the microscope. I know we're going to be talking about the Boeing whistleblower. Those have been huge stories. But we also want to hear on the stories that you want to talk about. For example, the latest developments in the Becky Hill saga that we will be exclusively reporting this coming week. Arrest could be soon for Becky Hill. We're going to talk about that on that Month in Review. But again, sign up for the newsletter on FITSNews, be on the lookout for that Google Sheet, and most importantly, tune in right here, 11 a.m. Friday on March 29th for the first ever live Month in Review.